The elevator doors opened on the fourth floor of Alderton Hall, and nobody looked up. That was the first thing he noticed. Not the slight, not the noise, not the cluster of faculty gathered around the long mahogany table at the far end of the corridor. Just the simple, clarifying fact that nobody looked up. A man stepped out of an elevator into the administration wing of one of the oldest universities in the country, and not one person in the hallway registered his arrival. He was wearing a gray wool cardigan, slightly worn at the left elbow. Dark trousers, clean but not pressed, shoes that had been resoled twice. He was carrying a canvas tote bag from a conference he had attended 11 years ago, and a paper cup of coffee he had bought from the cart on the ground floor, not from the faculty lounge. He stood still for a moment, the elevator doors closing softly behind him, and he looked down the corridor at the people who would, in 72 hours, learn his name for the first time. He was not supposed to be here today. The formal introduction, the announcement, the press release, the faculty assembly, was scheduled for Thursday. His office was not yet set up. His name was not yet on any door. The board had suggested he take the week to familiarize himself with the campus quietly, without ceremony, before the machinery of introduction began. He had taken that suggestion literally. He had walked the campus for 2 days. He had eaten in the student cafeteria. He had sat in the back of 2 undergraduate lectures without identifying himself. He had stood in the courtyard and watched the groundskeeping staff work, and thought about the budget line that covered their wages and whether it was adequate, because he had read the financial disclosures and he already knew it was not. Today, he had come to the 4th floor of Alderton Hall simply because he wanted to see the administrative corridor before it became, in some operational sense, his corridor. He wanted to see it as a stranger first. He had learned, over 30 years of institutional work, that the version of a place you see before anyone knows who you are is the only honest version you ever get. He got more honesty than he had anticipated. The cluster of faculty at the far end of the corridor were not trying to be quiet. That was the thing about people who had occupied a space for a long time. They stopped performing discretion. They spoke at the volume of people who have decided that wherever they are standing is, by definition, an appropriate place for them to be standing. There were 4 of them. He could see them clearly from where he stood. He did not move toward them. He moved instead toward the window alcove to his left, where a low bench sat beneath a row of framed faculty portraits, and he sat down, and he opened his canvas bag, and he took out a folder, and he appeared, to anyone who might have glanced his way, to be a maintenance worker reviewing a work order, or perhaps a visiting administrator waiting for an appointment, or perhaps nobody at all. He was, in fact, listening. I read the release. This was a woman's voice. Community college background. No research output in 6 years. 1 book published by a mid-tier academic press, and the reviews were, I'll be charitable, mixed. The board didn't consult anyone. A man's voice this time, senior. The kind of slow, deliberate cadence that had once passed for gravitas and now mainly passed for tenure. That's the part that offends me. Not even a courtesy call to the faculty senate. What exactly is his field? A third voice, younger, sharper. Someone who had learned to perform skepticism as a substitute for having done the reading. Environmental something? Environmental policy? Environmental studies? Environmental systems and institutional governance. The first woman again. Which means, functionally, nothing. It's the kind of interdisciplinary designation that means you weren't rigorous enough to belong to a single department. A brief pause. I've seen his CV. The older man again. The community college stint was 12 years. He was teaching introductory courses, introduction to environmental science, that kind of thing. I don't know what the board was thinking. I genuinely do not know. They wanted optics, the younger voice. Diverse background, non-traditional, first generation, all of that. It's a hire designed to be photographed, not to lead. He was sitting very still on the bench. His coffee cup was on the floor beside his right foot. His folder was open on his lap, and he had not looked at a single page of it since he sat down. His face was arranged in an expression of complete neutrality. If anyone had looked at him, and nobody had, they would have seen a man of about 55, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray at his temples and reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, sitting quietly in a corridor, giving the impression of someone who had all the time in the world. He did. "The thing that concerns me," the first woman said, "is the tenure review cycle. We're 18 months out. If he doesn't understand how this institution operates, and I see no evidence that he does, that process becomes a political football. I've spent 22 years building this department. I'm not going to have it dismantled by someone who thinks governance means writing policy briefs." "Has anyone actually met him?" The fourth voice, which had been silent until now, a softer voice, male, cautious. "Thursday," the older man. "The assembly, which, frankly, I intend to use productively. Meaning I intend to ask him, directly and on the record, what his vision is for research output targets in the next accreditation cycle, and we will see very quickly whether he has the vocabulary for this institution." A small silence. "He won't." The younger voice, with the easy certainty of someone who had made up their mind before the conversation began. "You can tell from the CV. There's nothing there." A man who spent 12 years at a community college teaching introductory courses and then pivoted to consulting? What does that even mean, consulting? Is not someone who has the intellectual architecture for a research university. He's going to be managed. The question is, who manages him? He picked up his coffee cup. He took a slow sip. He turned a page in his folder, though he still did not read it. "I suppose," the first woman said, with a tone that closed the conversation, "we'll know Thursday." They dispersed. He sat for another 4 minutes. Then he put the folder back in his canvas bag, picked up his paper coffee cup, and walked back to the elevator. He pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors opened. He stepped in. Just before they closed, one of the four, the younger man, the one with the easy certainty, walked past the elevator without looking at it, talking on his phone, his voice carrying. Now, the issue isn't the appointment. The issue is what it signals about the board's direction. The doors closed. He looked at his reflection in the brushed steel of the elevator doors, a man of 55 in a gray cardigan with a canvas tote bag and a paper coffee cup, a man who looked like he might be delivering something, or fixing something, or waiting for someone more important to arrive. He pressed the lobby button. He thought about what the woman had said. 22 years building this department. The certainty in her voice. The ownership. He had heard that tone before, in other institutions, in other corridors. The tone of someone who had confused the length of their tenure with the security of their position. He did not think she was a bad person. He thought she was a specific kind of person, intelligent, accomplished, and so embedded in the structure she had helped build that she could not imagine the structure ever being operated by someone other than herself. He thought about what the young man had said. Designed to be photographed, not to lead. He almost smiled, not from amusement. From the particular stillness that comes when you have just been handed the clearest possible picture of the work ahead. Please let me know in the comments where you were watching today before we continue. I'm always fascinated by how far these tales can go. Don't forget to subscribe to Old Man Dan's Tales if you like strong, poignant tales of treachery, secrets, and unforgettable retribution. Because this story only gets more bizarre from here on out. He did not go back to his hotel. He went instead to the campus library, which was open until 10, and he found a Carol in the back of the second-floor reading room, and he sat down. And this time, he actually read what was in the folder. The folder contained, among other things, the last 6 years of budget allocations for every academic department in the university, the last 3 faculty senate meeting transcripts, the accreditation body's preliminary review notes from 8 months ago, which contained 14 flagged items, 3 of which were classified as high priority, the HR summary of tenure-track positions filled versus positions budgeted over the same 6-year period, and the institutional performance metrics from the last strategic plan, the one that had been approved 4 years ago and quietly shelved after the first year when it became clear that the targets were not being met. He read for 3 hours. A graduate student 2 carols over fell asleep over a stack of journals. A librarian wheeled a cart of returned books past his row, glanced at him briefly, and moved on. He made notes in the margins in small, dense handwriting. He cross-referenced 3 items. He folded the corner of 1 page. At 9:40, he packed up the folder, put it back in his canvas tote, and walked to the campus exit. He had spent 30 years doing this kind of reading. That was the thing the 4 professors in the corridor did not know and could not have known from a CV. They had read the lines. They had not read what the lines represented. His name was Elias Beaumont Cole. He had been born in a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaning business in a city that most people knew only from highway signs. His mother had worked the counter. His father had driven a bus for 23 years. He had been the first person in his family to attend university, which he had done on a partial scholarship and 2 part-time jobs. He had taken 11 years to complete his undergraduate and graduate degrees, not because he was slow, but because he was paying for them in real time, course by course, semester by semester. The community college had not been a detour. It had been the point. He had taught introductory environmental science at Harwell Community College for 12 years, not because he could not get a university position, but because he had chosen not to. He had received 3 offers during that period. He had declined all 3. Harwell had an enrollment that was 64% first-generation students, 41% working adults, and a library that had been operating with a budget frozen since 2008. He had built a department from 4 courses to 19. He had written the curriculum for a certificate program in environmental compliance that had placed 312 graduates into employment within 18 months of completion. He had done this without a research budget, without graduate students, and without anyone in a corridor on the 4th floor of Alderton Hall paying any attention to it. The consulting, which had been presented by the young man as evidence of drift, was the other thing they had not read. The consulting was 11 years of work with the Federal Office of Environmental Quality, the agency that reviewed, approved, and sometimes denied the environmental impact certifications, without which no large-scale development project in the country could legally proceed. He had not been a consultant in the commercial sense. He had been the person the agency called when the science on a filing was disputed, when an environmental assessment was being challenged, when the legal team needed someone who could explain, in technical terms precise enough to survive a federal court review, exactly what a proposed project would do to a watershed, a wetland, or a migratory corridor. 11 years of that work had made him the person that 3 successive agency directors had called when they needed something done quietly and correctly. It had also made him, without his having sought it or announced it, one of the most consequential environmental policy figures in the country, not because he had published in the right journals or chaired the right committees, but because his work had shaped the decisions that shaped the landscape, literally, and because the people who mattered in that world knew exactly who he was. The board of Alderton University had not hired him for optics. They had hired him because the university's research output in environmental science and institutional governance, the 2 fields it had publicly committed to as its strategic priority, had stagnated for 6 years, because the accreditation body's preliminary review had flagged 3 high-priority items, 2 of which related directly to research integrity, and 1 of which related to faculty governance processes. Because the previous chancellor had left under circumstances that the press release had described as a mutual decision to pursue new directions, and that the board had described, in private, as a governance failure that had cost the institution its largest federal research grant and the goodwill of 2 of its 3 primary institutional funders. They had not needed someone who would photograph well. They had needed someone who had spent 30 years inside the machinery of institutional accountability and knew every gear by name. They had found Elias Beaumont Cole through the federal agency director, who had called the board chair directly. The conversation had lasted 4 minutes. The board chair had then called the rest of the board. That conversation had lasted longer. At the end of it, they had unanimously agreed to offer the position. The negotiation had been brief. He had asked for 3 things: full authority over the budget review process, direct oversight of all pending accreditation items, and the right to restructure any department whose performance metrics did not meet the targets he would set in the first 60 days. The board had agreed to all 3 without counteroffer. He had not told them about the 4th floor of Alderton Hall. He had not told them about the gray cardigan or the paper coffee cup or the elevator. He had simply said yes, he would start Thursday, and yes, he understood the scope of the work, and no, he did not need a formal welcome reception. He walked back to his hotel. It was a modest hotel, 4 blocks from campus. He had chosen it because it was 4 blocks from campus, not because of anything else about it. He sat on the edge of the bed and called his sister, who was the only person he called at this hour, and she answered on the 2nd ring, the way she always did, and he told her about the corridor. And she laughed, the deep, unguarded laugh of someone who had known him for 55 years and was not remotely surprised. "They don't know," she said. "No." "How long are you going to let them not know?" "Until Thursday." "And then?" "And then they'll know." She laughed again, less loudly this time. "You're gonna be fine, E." "I know." "You always know." A pause. "How's the campus?" "Beautiful," he said. And he meant it. He had meant it since the first day he walked through the gates. Alderton University was, by any measure, a beautiful institution. The old stone buildings, the quadrangle with its enormous oak trees, the library with its reading room windows that caught the afternoon light in a particular way that made you want to stay and read something serious. It was the kind of campus that made you feel the weight of what a university was supposed to be. Not a credential factory, not a research production unit, not a real estate portfolio with an academic program attached, but a place where people came to learn things that mattered, and where the people who taught them were accountable to something larger than their own departments. He believed in that. That was perhaps the thing that the people in the corridor would have found most surprising, if they had known it. He was not interested in the position because of what the position gave him. He was interested in it because of what it required him to do. The 3 flagged items in the accreditation review, the frozen budget lines, the stalled research output. The faculty governance processes that had, according to the meeting transcripts, devolved over several years into something that functioned more like an internal political operation than an academic oversight body. These were solvable problems. He had solved problems like these before, in other forms, in other institutions. He knew what the work looked like, and he was not afraid of it. He turned out the light. He slept well. Thursday arrived the way institutional events always do, with too many chairs, not enough coffee, and a room that smelled of carpet cleaning solution and low-grade anxiety. The faculty assembly was held in the main auditorium of Alderton Hall. There were 412 faculty members at Alderton University, of whom 289 had either confirmed attendance or appeared on the sign-in sheets by the time the assembly began at 10 o'clock. He did not enter from the back. He entered from the side door, through the service corridor, which was how he had learned to enter rooms. Not dramatically, not through the main entrance, where the entrance itself became an event, but quietly, from an angle where the room could be seen before the room could see him. He stood at the side of the stage for 30 seconds, watching. The board chair, a tall woman in her 60s named Dr. Constance Farrell, whose professional courtesy was absolute and whose patience for institutional dysfunction was, he had gathered from their conversations, exhausted, was at the podium, running through the formal introduction. He listened to the things she said about him with the mild detachment of a man hearing a story about someone he happened to know fairly well. He saw the 4 professors from the corridor seated in the 3rd row. The woman who had spoken first, he had since identified her as Dr. Patricia Aldous, chair of the Department of Social Sciences, 22 years at Alderton, published extensively in her field, 3 graduate students currently writing dissertations under her supervision, and the single largest individual claimant in the departmental budget allocation that was currently under the accreditation body's review. The older man, Professor Douglas Rent, professor of history, senior enough to have a named chair, the name of which was funded by an endowment that had been, he had also noted in his reading, managed with a degree of administrative opacity that the board's own financial auditors had flagged twice in the past 5 years, without any corrective action having been taken. The younger man, Dr. Calvin Price, assistant professor of political science, 2 years at Alderton, ambitious in the way that people are ambitious when they have decided that proximity to the right senior faculty is a career strategy. The 4th, quieter one, Professor Simone Adele, professor of literature, whose silence in that corridor he had not forgotten. He stepped onto the stage. The applause was polite. Faculty applause at these events is always a specific register, not warm, not cold, the acoustic equivalent of procedural acknowledgement. He stood at the podium, and he looked out at the room. "Thank you, Dr. Farrell," he said. His voice was even. Not projected, not performed. The kind of voice that required a room to go quiet in order to hear it, which meant that rooms always went quiet. He did not use notes. "I walked this campus for 2 days before today," he said. "I didn't identify myself to anyone. I wanted to see what the university looked like before anyone started performing it for me. I ate in the student cafeteria. I sat in the back of 2 lectures. I sat in this corridor for a while and listened. A small shift in the room, something that was not quite a sound. I want to tell you what I found," he said. "Not what I found on the campus. The campus is extraordinary, and I mean that without any of the diplomatic softening that usually attaches to that kind of statement. I want to tell you what I found in the documents. Because I spent 3 hours in the library on Tuesday evening reading the last 6 years of institutional records, and what I found there is the actual work I'm here to do." He talked for 32 minutes. He did not thank anyone for welcoming him. He did not perform humility, and he did not perform authority. He talked about the 3 flagged accreditation items as if they were engineering problems, which, in a sense, they were, and he described the corrective measures he intended to implement with a specificity that required the room to pay attention. He talked about the budget review with the same specificity. He talked about research output metrics and what they did and did not measure. He quoted, without attribution, from 2 of the Faculty Senate meeting transcripts, specific passages, not to embarrass anyone, but to identify the specific failure modes in the governance process that had produced the outcomes he was now responsible for correcting. Halfway through, he saw Dr. Patricia Aldous sit up slightly straighter. He continued. When he finished, there was a longer silence than these events usually produce, followed by applause that had more in it than procedural acknowledgement. Dr. Farrell opened the floor for questions. There were 14. He answered all of them. To the question about research output targets in the next accreditation cycle, asked by Professor Rent, who had apparently intended it as a test, he gave a 12-sentence answer that moved from the specific metrics to the structural conditions that had prevented those metrics from being met, and named, without raising his voice, the 3 departmental allocation processes that he considered the primary structural obstruction. Professor Rent did not ask a follow-up question. He wrapped up the assembly at 11:42. He thanked Dr. Farrell. He walked off the stage from the same side door he had entered, through the same service corridor. In the corridor, briefly alone, he stopped and stood still for a moment. He thought about what the young professor had said in the hallway on Tuesday. A hire designed to be photographed, not to lead. He thought about Professor Aldous. 22 years. The certainty in her voice. The ownership of a space that was not, in any legal or operational sense, hers to own. He was not angry. He had not been angry in the elevator, and he was not angry now. Anger was a response to surprise, and he had not been surprised. He had been, if anything, informed. The corridor on Tuesday had been one of the most useful 40 minutes of his professional life, because it had shown him clearly and without filter exactly what he was working with, who held what assumptions, and where the resistance would be positioned when the work began. The work always produced resistance. That was not a problem. That was a feature. Institutions that produced no resistance to change were institutions that had already stopped functioning. The resistance told you where the actual structure was, as opposed to the official structure that appeared in the org chart. He had spent 30 years learning to read resistance, the way a structural engineer reads load-bearing walls, not as an obstacle, but as information. He picked up his canvas tote bag, which he had left against the wall of the service corridor, and he walked to his office now, the nameplate having been installed that morning, and he sat down at the desk, and he began. The first 60 days were methodical. He met with every department chair individually, not in groups. The meetings were scheduled for 45 minutes, and he ran them to 44. He asked each chair 3 questions. What is working in your department? What is not working? And what would you change if you had full authority to change it? He took notes by hand. He did not share the notes. He did not use the meetings to signal anything. He used them to listen and to cross-reference what he heard against what he had read, and to build in his own mind a picture of the institution that was accurate rather than official. He met with Dr. Patricia Aldous on the 12th day. She arrived precisely on time, which told him something. She sat without being invited to sit, which told him something else. She was an impressive person. He had no quarrel with her intelligence or her accomplishments or the genuine rigidity of her principles. She had built something real over 22 years, and she knew it. She also knew, he could tell within the first 4 minutes, that he had read the budget allocations. She knew it because he referred to specific line items in her department's funding with a precision that was not accidental and that she was too sharp not to recognize. She adjusted, midway through the meeting, from the version of herself she had prepared for this conversation to a slightly more careful version. He noted it without acknowledging it. At the end of the meeting, she said, "I'll be frank with you, Chancellor. There are members of this faculty who are not certain your background prepared you for the specific demands of a research institution of this standing." He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. She waited for more. He did not provide more. She left. He met with Dr. Calvin Price on the 19th day. Price had, in the 10 days since the assembly, apparently recalibrated. He arrived at the meeting with a carefully prepared set of talking points about the political science department's research agenda and its alignment with the university's strategic priorities. He was thorough and competent and was performing a version of himself designed to be useful to the new chancellor rather than to be assessed by him, which was, Cole recognized, intelligent. He did not hold the corridor conversation against Price. He was 27 years into a tenure-track position, which was to say he was in the most structurally precarious position in academic life, and he had done what people in precarious positions do, which was align himself with whoever appeared to be in the room with power. At the end of their meeting, Cole said, "Your work on regulatory capture and institutional inertia, the 2019 paper." Price looked slightly startled. "Yes. The framework in Section 3. I'd like you to apply it to our own governance structure and give me a memo." "Not a paper. A memo. Internal. 15 pages. Price was quiet for a moment. You want me to analyze the university's governance structure using that framework? Yes. Including the faculty senate process? Especially that. Price left looking like a man who had arrived expecting a conversation and had instead been handed a set of tools and a job. Professor Rent he did not summon. He encountered him instead at the faculty senate meeting on the 23rd day, the first one Cole attended as a non-voting observer, which the bylaws permitted and which no previous chancellor had apparently done. Rent was running the meeting as Senate chair with the deliberate pacing of a man who was very conscious of being watched. Cole sat in the back row with his notepad and his reading glasses on his forehead and said nothing for 2 hours. At the end of the meeting, as people were gathering their things, Rent walked over to him. Chancellor. Slightly stiff, the stiffness of someone who had said things he now knew had been an error in judgment, without being certain that the error had been witnessed. Professor Rent. Cole stood up. He was taller than Rent, which was not something he had intended as information, but which registered in the space between them anyway. That was useful. I appreciate you letting me observe. Of course. A pause. The Senate is always open to... I noticed you haven't resolved the item about the endowment management audit. That item has been... There's been some complexity around the governance process for that particular review. I know. I read the last 3 transcripts. He picked up his tote bag. I've asked the board's audit committee to take it up directly. They'll be in touch. He smiled. Not warmly, not coldly. The specific smile of a man who has just resolved something and is ready to move on. He walked out. He could feel, in the particular quality of the silence behind him, the sound of something beginning to be understood. The faculty honors banquet was held on the 44th day of his tenure. It was an annual event, the Dean's Circle Dinner, officially, though everyone called it the banquet, and it was the institution's main internal social ceremony. The event had been planned months before his appointment by the committee that always planned it, which was chaired by Dr. Aldous. It was held in the university's grand dining hall, a room of vaulted ceilings and long oak tables and portraits of former chancellors lining the walls, most of whom Cole had read about with varying degrees of admiration. He attended. He arrived, as he arrived everywhere, through the side entrance, and he stood for a while near the edge of the room before anyone registered him. He was wearing the same gray cardigan. He had considered wearing something different. He owned something different, and had decided against it, not as a statement, simply because the gray cardigan was what he wore. The room held 220 people, department chairs, senior faculty, endowment board members, a few trustees, the heads of the major research centers. The honorees for the evening, 4 senior faculty members receiving the university's Distinguished Service Award, were seated at the head table. Dr. Aldous was one of them. Professor Rent was another. He found a seat near the middle of the room, between a professor of chemistry he had met once and a researcher from the Environmental Studies Center he had not yet met. And he ate his dinner, and he listened to the table conversations, and he responded when spoken to. And he did not call attention to himself. The award ceremony began after dinner. Dr. Aldous was introduced first, her 22 years, her departmental contributions, her graduate students, her service. She stood at the podium and accepted the award with the practiced grace of someone who had given this kind of speech before and knew exactly how to calibrate gratitude and authority in the same register. She was good at it. He could see why she had built what she had built. She was 3 sentences into her remarks when the dean, a compact, precise man named Dr. Harlan Webb, who had been at the university for 9 years and who Cole had spent considerable time assessing before deciding he was one of the institution's functional assets, leaned down from the raised table and said something to his assistant, who walked quickly to the side of the room and spoke into a radio. Nothing happened immediately. The evening continued, Professor Rent received his award. 2 other faculty members received theirs. There were toasts. There were the usual institutional warm exchanges, the acknowledgement of donors, the naming of endowments, the careful performance of a community that wanted to believe it was functioning as a community. At 8:47, the president of the university's primary external funding body, a man named Robert Stahl, who had flown in from Washington for the event, and whom Cole had personally called 3 weeks prior, stood up from the table where he had been seated and asked to say a few words. This was slightly irregular, but not unprecedented, and the room settled into the attentive courtesy that these moments require. Stahl was a direct man. He had spent 20 years distributing federal research funding and had no patience for indirection. I want to acknowledge, Stahl said, the new leadership of this institution, and I want to do it in a specific way. He looked across the room. Elias, do you want to stand up? Cole stood up from the middle of the room. From the table he had found himself, between the chemistry professor and the environmental researcher, in the gray cardigan. The room went very still. He could see Dr. Aldous from where he stood. He could see the specific moment, not a gasp, not a gesture, not an expression, when she understood what she was looking at. The man in the gray cardigan, at the table near the middle of the room. The man who had been there, quietly, for the last 2 hours. The man at the elevator on Tuesday morning. She had not recognized him at the assembly, because at the assembly he had been on a stage, and she had been prepared to see a chancellor, and so she had seen one. Here, in the gray cardigan, at a table in the middle of the room, she had seen a man eating dinner. She had seen, specifically, the kind of man she had been discussing on Tuesday morning. He watched the understanding arrive. It was slow and total, exactly as he had known it would be. Stahl was saying things about the federal agency's renewed confidence in Alderton's research direction. He was saying things about the specific appointment that had produced that confidence. He was saying things about the 30 years of work that had preceded this appointment, and about the particular paper that Cole had co-authored with the agency's chief scientific officer, that had, Stahl said, been the single most cited policy document in the agency's last decade of environmental review decisions. The room was very quiet. Cole did not look at Professor Rent. He looked at Stahl, and he nodded when Stahl looked at him, and he sat down when the brief moment of acknowledgement was complete. He did not perform modesty, and he did not perform satisfaction. He sat down, and he picked up his water glass, and he drank from it, and he set it back on the table. After the formal program concluded and the room began to move and reconstitute itself into the standing, glass-in-hand social arrangement that these events always produce, Dr. Aldous moved through the crowd toward him. She moved with purpose. He watched her coming from a distance, not because he had been watching for her, but because he had a 30-year habit of monitoring rooms. She arrived. She stood in front of him. She was, he could see, assembling something. The thing she was assembling had many components: professionalism, composure, the specific intelligence required to acknowledge an error without performing self-flagellation. She was doing it reasonably well. He gave her credit for that. Chancellor Cole, she said. Dr. Aldous. A brief pause. I believe I owe you an apology. He looked at her for a moment. For what, specifically? She met his eyes. She was, he thought, a woman who had not backed down from very many things in 22 years, and she was not backing down now so much as standing in a different position relative to a truth that had reorganized itself. For conclusions I drew before I had adequate information. He was quiet for a moment. Dr. Aldous, he said, I spent Tuesday morning in that corridor because I wanted to understand this institution before it understood me. I heard what I heard, and I will tell you honestly. A pause that was neither for effect nor for drama, simply for the particular precision of meaning what you say. I found it useful. She looked at him. Useful, she repeated. You told me, without knowing you were telling me, exactly where the institutional assumptions were most fixed, where the resistance would be, where the work was going to be hardest. He picked up his water glass. That's not nothing. Most people spend months trying to get that information. I got it in 40 minutes. A very brief silence. You're not going to... She stopped. What? I was going to ask if you were going to hold it against us. He looked at her steadily. I'm going to hold you accountable to the budget review. I'm going to hold you accountable to the accreditation process. I'm going to hold the departmental governance process to the standards it should have been held to for the last 3 years. He set down the water glass. That's not retaliation, Dr. Aldous. That's the job. She nodded, the specific nod of someone who has just understood the terms of a thing. He moved away into the room. He found Professor Simone Adele, the quiet one, the one who had said very little in the corridor, standing near the window with a glass of wine. She was looking at the portraits of former chancellors on the wall. He stopped beside her. They looked at the portraits together for a moment. You didn't say much, he said, on Tuesday. She turned to look at him. She did not pretend not to understand what Tuesday meant. No, she said. Why not? She considered the question with a seriousness that he appreciated. Because I hadn't read the file. A pause. I was the only one in that hallway who knew I hadn't read the file. He nodded. I'm a literature professor, she said. I know what it means to make a judgment about a text before you've read it. He almost smiled. And I was ashamed of being in that conversation. She looked back at the portraits. Not enough to stop it, but ashamed. He was quiet for a moment. Read the file, he said. Then come talk to me. I want to know what you think of the accreditation review section on interdisciplinary programs. She looked at him. My department's being restructured, she said. It was not quite a question. Every department is being reviewed, he said. Some will be restructured, some won't. Depends what the review finds. And the criteria are the same for everyone. He picked up a glass of water from a passing tray. Which is the point. He moved on. He found Dr. Calvin Price near the back of the room, near the drinks table, with the particular posture of a man who would rather be invisible. Price saw him coming and straightened up. The memo, Cole said. Price blinked. I've started. Take your time. Do it right. He paused. I read your 2019 paper twice, Price. The framework is genuinely good. Don't write a memo that's less than the paper. Price was quiet for a moment. You read it before the assembly? Before I accepted the position. He moved past. 15 pages. He found Professor Rent, finally, at the far end of the room, near the exit. Rent had been making a slow and increasingly deliberate movement toward the door for the last 20 minutes, which Cole had tracked from across the room with the patient attention of a man who knew where everything in a room was and what it was doing. Rent stopped when Cole appeared in his path. Not a dramatic stop, just the stop of a large man who has found the door is less accessible than expected. Professor Rent. Chancellor. Careful. The careful of someone who has spent 2 decades in academic politics and knows when a conversation is being initiated by someone who holds the longer cards. The Senate meeting. You ran it well. Rent absorbed this. Thank you. The endowment audit. Still mild. Still conversational. The board's committee is going to want documentation going back 5 years. I'll need your cooperation on the timeline. Of course. 5 years, Cole said again. Everything. Rent nodded, the specific nod of someone who has understood precisely what 5 years of everything means. Cole stepped aside and let him reach the door. He stood in the room for another hour. He talked to the environmental researcher, whose work he had read and found interesting. He talked to 2 trustees about the federal funding renewal process. He talked to a graduate student who had somehow ended up at the dinner and who was paralyzed with the specific terror of being at an event above her social pay grade. And he talked to her about her dissertation research with the genuine attentiveness of a man who was interested in what she had to say, because he was. At 10:15, he put on his coat, a practical, mid-weight coat, not expensive, and he picked up his canvas tote bag, which he had stowed beneath his chair at the beginning of the evening, and he walked to the side exit and into the cool campus night. The months that followed were not dramatic. That was the thing about institutional work when it was done correctly. It was methodical and persistent, and it produced results through the slow accumulation of correct decisions rather than through a single decisive moment. He had learned this 30 years ago, and he had never stopped believing it. The budget review was completed in 61 days. It found what he had expected to find, a pattern of departmental allocation that had, over 6 years, drifted away from the strategic priorities of the institution and toward the maintenance of existing power structures within the faculty. 3 departments had been consistently over-allocated relative to their research output. 2 had been underallocated relative to their output and their potential. He restructured the allocation process, establishing a transparent, metrics-based framework that was reviewed by the Faculty Senate, the reformed Faculty Senate, because that process had also been restructured, with Price's memo serving as the foundational analysis document before being applied. Dr. Aldis's department was reviewed under the same criteria as every other department. It was not singled out. It was also not protected. The review found 2 items that required corrective action. She implemented both. The third item, the one that was most complex, took 4 months of sustained engagement to resolve. She did the work. He credited her for doing the work. Professor Rent's endowment audit produced findings that were not criminal, but were, as the board's committee put it, significantly below the standard of transparency required of a named institutional endowment. The endowment's management was transferred to the university's central financial office. Rent retained his named chair. That, he had decided, was not the point. The point was the process. He kept the chair and lost the oversight of the money, which was exactly what the resolution required. Dr. Price's memo was, as Cole had expected, very good. He sent Price a 2-line email. The framework is right. Use it in the course you're teaching next semester. That email was, as Price later told people, the first time he had received professional validation from anyone at the level of institutional leadership, and it changed how he thought about his own work, not in a sentimental way, but in a structural way. He began to see himself as someone whose analysis had operational consequences, rather than purely academic ones, which is a different kind of confidence, and a more durable one. Professor Adele came to see him 6 weeks after the banquet. She had read the file. She had opinions about the accreditation review section on interdisciplinary programs, specific, sharp, well-grounded opinions that came from a literature professor who had spent 20 years watching interdisciplinary programs be designed by people who did not understand what interdisciplinary actually meant. He listened for 45 minutes. He changed 2 recommendations in the final accreditation response document based on what she said. He did not tell her he had done this. She found out because she read the document when it was published, and she saw her own thinking in it. And she came to his office doorway. She did not quite come in, and she said, "You used the argument about threshold concepts." "Yes," he said. "It was right." She looked at him for a moment. "I thought you were going to restructure my department." "I might still," he said. "That's not personal." She left, but differently than she had arrived. The accreditation body completed its review 14 months into his tenure. All 3 high-priority items were resolved. The 2 medium-priority items were resolved. The body issued a letter of commendation, not the standard form letter, but an actual letter, written by the review chair that named specific improvements and called out the unusual speed and institutional coherence of the corrective process. The letter was framed and hung in the main corridor of Alderton Hall, next to the portraits of previous chancellors. He had not asked for it to be framed. He found it there one morning and looked at it for a moment and moved on. The federal funding renewal was confirmed 8 months in. Stahl called him personally to confirm it. Not an email, a call, which was Stahl's form of emphasis. The grant was restored to full value, plus a 12% increase, contingent on the new research output targets that Cole had set in the first 30 days. The targets were met. He had not been surprised by this. When you give people the right resources, clear accountability, and the knowledge that the process is fair, they generally do the work. That, he had found, was what most institutions forgot. Not the strategy, not the metrics, the fairness. The knowledge in every department and at every level that the rules applied to everyone equally, that the criteria were the same for the long-tenured professor and the first-year researcher, that the person at the top of the institution was operating from principle rather than relationship. Fairness was not warm. It was not comfortable. But it was the only thing that produced genuine institutional function rather than the performance of it. He had been chancellor for 14 months when he went back to the fourth-floor corridor. Not for a specific reason. He was walking to a meeting and the elevator stopped on 4, which sometimes happened, and he got off because he was 3 minutes early and had found over the years that hallways were useful thinking spaces. He walked to the window alcove. The bench was still there, beneath the row of faculty portraits, which now included 2 new additions from the previous year's Distinguished Service Awards. He looked at the portraits for a moment. He sat down on the bench. The corridor was quiet. It was mid-morning, between classes, and the administrative wing had the particular hush of a space between its operational peaks. He could hear distantly the sound of the campus, the door opening somewhere, a cart on the floor below, the muffled sound of a class in progress. He thought about the man who had sat here 14 months ago, the man in the gray cardigan with the paper coffee cup and the canvas tote bag, sitting quietly in a corridor, listening to people who did not see him describe with complete confidence exactly what he was not. He thought about what it had felt like, not the anger that he hadn't felt, not the vindication that he had carefully not allowed himself to feel too early, not even the grim professional satisfaction of a plan working as intended. Something simpler than any of those things, something that he had found over 30 years of work in institutions that did not initially recognize what he was or what he could do to be the most reliable emotional resource available to him. The knowledge that the work was going to be done correctly, regardless of what anyone in any corridor said about him. He had carried that into every institution he had ever entered. Into the community college, where the first 3 years had been a sustained exercise in building something from nothing under conditions of consistent underfunding and administrative indifference. Into the federal agency, where the first year had been a sustained exercise in proving to people who had their own assumptions that his specific kind of knowledge was worth having. Into this corridor on a Tuesday morning, when 4 people who did not see him described a man who did not exist. He had carried the work with him. He had always carried it. He stood up. He picked up his canvas tote bag. He took the stairs down because he had time and because the stairwell had a window on each landing that looked out over the courtyard, and the light through those windows at this hour was, he had found, very good. 14 months later, 2.5 years into his tenure, he drove to a school gymnasium in the neighborhood where he had grown up, in the city that most people knew only from highway signs, to watch his daughter's school orchestra concert. He arrived late because a meeting had run long, and he slipped into a seat near the back just as the orchestra was beginning its second piece. His daughter did not see him come in. She was focused on her music stand, her cello positioned correctly, her expression the specific, concentrated expression of a 12-year-old who takes something seriously. He sat in the plastic chair, and he watched her play. The gymnasium had fluorescent lights and a concrete floor and metal folding chairs and the particular acoustic quality of a room that was not designed for music, but was being used for it anyway. Parents around him were recording on phones. A toddler in the third row was making intermittent sounds. Someone's phone buzzed loudly and was silenced with the guilty speed of the cot. His daughter played. She played well. She had been practicing for 6 months in the room next to his in the apartment he maintained near campus, and he had heard her practicing every evening when he came home early enough to hear it, which was not every evening, but was more evenings than his schedule should technically have permitted, because he had decided early in this work that the schedule served the life, not the other way around. He was not unchanged, exactly. No one who does serious institutional work is unchanged by it. He had read more budget documents than he could count. He had had hundreds of conversations. He had made decisions that had consequences for people's professional lives, and he had carried those decisions with the seriousness they deserved. He had had difficult moments, and he had had satisfying ones, and he had had the kind of ordinary, undramatic moments that make up most of what a life actually is. But he was driving the same car he had been driving when he accepted the position, a 12-year-old sedan in a color that the manufacturer had discontinued, and he was carrying the same canvas tote bag, and he was sitting in a plastic chair in a gymnasium in the city where he had grown up, watching his daughter play the cello, and none of the things that had happened in the past 2.5 years had changed any of that. His daughter finished the piece. She looked up from her music stand. She scanned the audience with the specific scanning expression of a child looking for a face, and found his in the back row, and her expression changed. He raised his hand. Not a wave, just the particular stillness of a raised hand that said, "I'm here. I saw you. That was good." She looked back at her music stand. The orchestra began its third piece. He sat in the plastic chair, and he listened to his daughter play, and the fluorescent lights were not flattering, and the concrete floor was cold, and the toddler was making sounds again, and someone else's phone was buzzing, and it was exactly as it should be, and he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he had always been doing, paying attention to what was in front of him, with the full quality of his attention, regardless of who was watching. He had never needed anyone to see him clearly in order to know who he was. That was the thing, in the end, that none of them had understood. Not Aldous in the corridor, not Rent with his careful caution, not Price with his easy certainty. Not any of the institutions in 30 years that had looked at the gray cardigan and the canvas tote bag and the paper coffee cup and seen something ordinary. They had all eventually understood. But the understanding was never the point. The work was always the point. And the work was simply continuing, one careful, methodical, correct decision at a time, in whatever room he happened to be in, seen or unseen, recognized or unremarkable, exactly the same either way, undeniable.